Morgen, Rico. Ich hoffe, ja. Ich muss ja nur ankündigen erstmal. Ich werde ja nur ankündigen. Oh ja. Ja, spannend. Ich habe Arbo auch schon gehört über das Netz.
Nicht so, also in Physikerkonform, das heißt, wir sprachen der was ist, was du da kriegst. Und das ist sehr spannend. Das ist natürlich jetzt ich habe eine
Danke, Sebastian, übrigens. Ich werde jetzt die YouTuber verfolgen, ob sie irgendwas in den Chat schreiben, habe ich mir vorgenommen. Ja, falls sie irgendwas schreiben. Mal gucken, wie das geht. Ja.
Falls jemand doch nebenbei einfach so reinlesen könnte, wäre vielleicht doch mal drauf hinweisen.
Ja, wir können ja ein bisschen antizipieren, also man kann ja schon, wenn man weiß, was kommt, kann man schon mal hingehen. Da will sich dafür Schlange gemacht, das der Schlange gemacht ist. Das ist auch gut sein.
Prima di tutto vorrei dare un caloroso benvenuto, quasi come apertura, prima dell'apertura, a tutti gli ospiti di lingua italiana al nostro congresso, che si terrà principalmente in inglese. Als Präsident der Musikhochschule Lübeck bin ich besonders stolz, diesen Kongress zu eröffnen und Sie hier vor Ort und im digitalen Raum begrüßen zu dürfen. Zu einem Kongress, der gleichzeitig auf eine lange gelebte Tradition an unserer Hochschule zurückschaut, das Miteinander von Wissenschaft, Theorie und Praxis, vom inspirierten Zusammenspiel, von instrumentaler Ausbildung und kompositorischem Schaffen, auf das gemeinsame Arbeiten von Studierenden, Alumni, Lehrenden und Forschenden. Gleichzeitig ist es auch ein Ausblick, ja ein Aufbruch, der manifestiert, dass der Begriff und die Praxis der Kreation an Fahrt gewinnt hier in Lübeck. Gerade gestern durfte ich die erfolgte Besetzung der neuen Ensemble- und Projektleitung für Neue Musik verkünden. Die neu geschaffene Professur für digitale Kreation ist ausgeschrieben. Komposition, Improvisation und digitale sowie analoge Kreation finden zusammen. Und gerade in diesem Kongress wird der Bezug zur Popularmusik, zu den neuen Medien und zur Performance besonders deutlich. Yes, the pandemic has its clowns on us too. But we do not allow to be stopped doing the most important thing a University of Music has to do. We present, interpret, talk to each other and about music, exchange ideas, meet each other, even if it takes place in the digital space, and encounter the seldom heard, the music on the fringe that is so at home in the midst of departure into future, exploration and research at its best. Ich freue mich ungemein auf die kommenden 2 Tage und die Chance, mit den Fans von Fausto Romitellis Musik und allen Neugierigen, die es noch werden wollen, über alle Grenzen hinweg in Kontakt zu stehen. Das ist wiederum ein Vorteil der digitalen Verbreitung der hier geschürften Forschungsergebnisse. Schließen möchte ich, bevor ich an unseren Vizepräsidenten für Forschung, Prof. Dr. Oliver Korte, überreiche, mit einem Dank an alle Beteiligten. Den Referentinnen und Referenten, den Musikerinnen und Musikern und allen, die im Hintergrund verantwortungsvolle Arbeit leisten und geleistet haben. Sei es für den Sound auf der Bühne, den Livestream, die Werbung und das Marketing, das Licht bis hin zur allgemeinen Verwaltung. It is precisely the excellent cooperation between our teachers, students and staff that distinguished the University of Music Lübeck, and will make the coming days a success. A warm welcome to the Sound Lab of Professor Patrick e festeggiamo i giorni di Fausto Romitelli a Lübeck. Grazie.
Thank you very much to our President, Professor Gubler. In the name of the entire organizing team, I want to very warmly welcome you to the first German conference that is entirely dedicated to the work of Fausto Romitelli. Welcome to all the listeners. We have only a very few here sitting in the Kammermusiksaal of the University of Music in Lübeck, due to the hygiene regulations, but hopefully some more will choose to join us digitally online. I would like to extend a special welcome to our speakers of the next 2 days. Thank you all very much for accepting the invitation to participate so that we now have the opportunity to discuss the fascinating music of Fausto Romitelli. Many staff members and students of the Musikhochschule have a share in making this conference possible. I can't, unfortunately, call them all by name, but please let me at least mention some groups of participants and contributors. I want to thank very much the musicians who will perform Romitelli's legendary triptych, Professor Bad Trip, this evening, and the musicians who will perform Romitelli and Pink Floyd tomorrow. A huge thank you goes to our untiring sound, video, light, stage, software technicians. Their very important work is even more essential in the current situation and in times like that. Thank you also to our public relations team, the Artistic Operation Office, and all the other helping hands that made this possible. The idea of this Congress is to bring together international experts. Most of them you see here via Zoom, in the music of Fausto Romitelli, with scholars from Lübeck as well as graduates and students. In fact, in the past few years, Lübeck has become some kind of a little hotspot in Romitelli research. And at least from a geographical point of view, this may surprise a bit. The approaches of our 12 talks are interdisciplinary. That is, musicological, educational, psychoacoustical, and literary. The conference proceedings will, hopefully so, published very quickly in a volume of the series Schriften der Musikhochschule Lübeck. Now, Fausto Romitelli is an outstanding figure in the landscape of contemporary music. He expressly flees the ivory tower, he dives deeply into popular culture, and he really loves to make his hands dirty. His modernity is not a modernity of material. On the contrary, he makes use of material that others would call used up or even dubious, at least from the perspective of contemporary music. For example, a quote from the Alpine Symphony by Richard Strauss, or a motif from a Pink Floyd song. Adorno would certainly have labeled these materials as impotent clichés. But Romitelli's music is less about material and much more about process. He lays hand, and often in a very violent hand, on the material. He filters, he deforms, he degenerates. Romitelli mirrors social and media processes that, however sweet and seductive they might begin, often enough end in addiction and incapacitation. Given the current social tendencies, it seems to me that the relevance of what Romitelli's work has to tell us is only growing. Now, I hope, and I'm quite sure, that we will have a very interesting, informative, and inspiring weekend with discussions on Romitelli's aesthetics, his compositional techniques, his view on modern society, and his analysis of medial processes and the medial impact on our reception. Our conference officially starts with the first talk, and I have the pleasure to give floor to our first chair, my dear colleague Sascha Lemke, and especially to our first speaker, a personal friend of Romitelli's and a major expert in the field of his music, Alessandro Arbo. Thank you very much.
Good morning to everybody. I think everybody who got addicted to Romitelli's music very quickly realized that if he wanted to, or she wanted to get to know the composer or learn more about the music, Alessandro Arbo was one of the first persons who provided us with texts, with books he edited, with conferences. I remember going to Strasbourg to Festival Musica, where I learned a lot about Romitelli, and so I'm very happy that he will open our conference here. He's going to talk about the electric sound of Fausto Romitelli between modernity and post-modernism. So I'm very curious, and a warm welcome to Strasbourg.
Vielen Dank für diese Grüße, auf Italienisch auch. Es war eine schöne Überraschung. Wir haben diese Sprache nie gesprochen. Und für diese Präsentation, ich versichere allen, ich werde auf Englisch sprechen, auch wenn mein Englisch nicht gut ist, aber vielleicht werden Sie es besser verstehen, als wenn ich auf Italienisch oder Französisch spreche. I warmly thank Oliver Korte and the other organizer for inviting me to this wonderful symposium. And I try now to share my presentation. Just a minute. So here it is. So I hope you can see the slide. So I would have loved so much to be there with you, of course. Regretfully, the health crisis prevent me and other colleagues from doing so. I will try to do my best from home. I hope you can hear me well enough and that you can follow the conference in this format. Fausto, you just said, has been a great friend to me. We were the same age. We had good times together. We came from the same town, Gorizia. It's a charming small town in Italy on the border with Slovenia. Once located on the outskirts of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So this a title of a work by Fausto has shown these in a certain measure. And I remember with emotion the moments I spent with him at his house or walking along the river Isonzo, losing ourselves in passionate and futile conversation on all kinds of subjects. Music at first, but also literature, philosophy, movies, and of course, girls. Some years after the composition of Professor Battery, Fausto entrusted me with the editing of a book dedicated to his work. The book was a collective book and was published in Italian under the title Il corpo elettrico, the electric body, and a few years later, actually 1 year after his death, in French. Here it is. Where is the... Yes. Also thanks to Daniel Cohen-Levinas and Michael Levinas in this French edition, who were also great friends of Fausto. I then had the opportunity to edit 2 other books on his music, and I'm very, very happy to see that it continues to interest the public, the musicians, the composer, the musicologists. This symposium will certainly be a fantastic opportunity to enter Romitelli's world and to analyze his compositional strategies, thanks to the contribution of many excellent musicologists and musicians. My communication will not go into technical details, but will try to take stock of some general categories that usually guide the discourse on what has now become the Romitelli style. I'm particularly interested in considering the meaning of an important ingredient of his style, the so-called electric sound. Actually, such a sound doesn't need to be uncovered. It is a salient feature of Romitelli's work. Think of the distorted cello solos in Professor Battery, or of the powerfully saturated soundscapes of Trash TV trance. Hendrix, Lou Reed, David Bowie, Aphex Twin make sudden appearance, sometimes discreetly being simply evoked, sometimes in the form of an explicit quotation. Here is a performance of Trash TV Trance by Lucia Derrico. In the context of a work of musique savante, such imports might appear as knowing winks to postmodern compositional strategies, which are notoriously prone to citation and eager to establish forms of communication with the listener, to second their perceptive abilities. Romitelli was entirely aware of this and rejected this idea, claiming loud and clear that his poetics had nothing to do with post-modernism. And here is a quotation: "My music is not a melting pot," he said in an interview with Veronique Brandot, "nor is it postmodern music." Still, to my ears, this work bears the stamp of a composer with a genuine attention to the diversity of the early 21st century musical world, who no longer allowed himself to be guided by the imperatives of the modernist approach, centered on the idea of a necessary progress of a language considered as artistically more advanced or essential. My aim here will be to examine this singularity and attempt to gain a better understanding of the positioning of Romitelli's work among the musical poetics of his time, and more broadly, of the aesthetic and symbolic meaning it carries. So, Before we embark on this journey, well, let me briefly clarify what I mean by electric sound. Indeed, the phrase has several meanings, the most common of which refers to the rock genre and all its subgenres, such as hard rock, metal, grunge, etc. It is also used to refer to the oral morphology produced by an electric guitar or bass. Additionally, in music, a distinction is sometimes made between electric and electronic sound. The latter is associated with electrophones, sound generators, synthesizer, electronic keyboards, and obviously all digital devices, from the sampler to the computer. In either case, on a physical level, what we are hearing is the result of a double conversion from the mechanical vibration to the electrical or electromagnetic flux, and in turn, from that flux to the vibration of a loudspeaker membrane. So, but for the perception, there is an important difference. Take an electric guitar and the sampler, both amplified. Even if the sounds we are hearing both come from the same source, the speakers, they appear to call for two different listening stances. The sound of an analog or digital electronic device calls for an acoustic listening. We are focused on a morphology and on a dynamic. Adopting a reduced listening stance seems relatively simple. Yeah. Electric sound, on the other hand, calls for an instrumental listening, in a particularly oral morphology, and then through it we look for a producing gesture usually. Crucially, this isn't just a metaphorical quest, but a real one. We expect that this gesture comes from a human subject. This is a perceptually important fact, even though it does not apply to all cases. An electric sound, meaning more precisely an electrified sound, emanates from the act of eliciting something from a body. Something, or better yet, someone, has made it vibrate, and has obviously done that in a particular manner, by hitting, by pinching it, attacking it quickly, with virtuosity, energy, tension, violence, and so on. Let us now come back to Romitelli. From the first listen, his music manifests the appropriation of a certain aesthetics associated with electric sound. Most of all, perhaps, that of psychedelic rock, which was increasingly foregrounded from the mid-1990s on, but also thrash. What were the reasons for this choice? As already said, the composer explicitly stated his intention. What he was after was not a melting pot of genres. It was rather the exploration of the potentiality of an oral matter closer to our lived experience. This belief was a cornerstone of his poetics, and the key reason for his taste for underground cultural expressions. Not a facile hedonism, not a simple joys of collage, but a thirst for knowledge, for total feeling and creative affirmation. Indeed, if we identify post-modernism with such a brand of hedonism, and more broadly with the advent of a stylistic eclecticism, we find that it is very much at odds with Romitelli's poetics, which remained faithful to the idea that a composer must never content himself with a formulaic language. There can, however, be other ways to envision postmodernism, starting with the approach that emphasizes principles that were central in a modernist or avant-garde perspective. In fact, as Marco Mazzolini has noted, Romitelli's very way of raising the question of musical language through the introduction of deviation or gray areas that call into question its own linear development may suggest the modernity turning on itself, a reversal fairly similar to that described critically, of course, by Jean-François Lyotard. To Romitelli, history cannot be merely a storehouse for the lovers of collage. It becomes the visual field of the gaze, its horizon and its flesh itself. That's a quotation from an article by Mazzolini. Actually, this music presents itself as a sort of exercise of anamnesis, creating soundscapes in which the debris of the tonal and modal world mix with repetitive bass notes that sounds like monstrously slowed down, expanded phonemes. Audiodrum, for instance, explicitly distorts orchestral sound and ushers us into a technological dystopia of sorts, a world in which interference, electric sound, and feedback have become more natural than the sound of acoustic instruments. The beginning of L'Azur des Déserts, that's the first part of Mediterraneo, or the beginning of Lost for voice and 15 instruments with a text by Morrison, are striking example of Romitelli's visionary sound absorption, paying little heed to the band on introducing clear harmonies, but also feeling free to assail and corrupt them, as in the case of the Pink Floyd chord that starts his video opera. This is a technique I think for the first time is used in this composition, the second part of Mediterraneo. We can hear just a little part of this. Here it is. This was the first part of this L'Azur des Déserts. You see this chord, very in harmony, very reconcilable, and then a way to assail, to corrupt them. So, as in the technique of the beginning of Lost, in fact, and of the an index of the metal also. There is an openly polemical dimension to such a move, signifying the introduction in a contemporary music perceived as anemic of an energy and a sense of movement highlighted by the power of the amplifiers. That's another important feature of his work, and the use of obsessive loops generated by the bass, as in Cupio di Solvi for ensemble. This is the example. I remember very well this the first performance of this composition at the festival Présence. It was, I think, the first time that Fausto used a loop generated by the bass, so that in a so clear way. It was, in fact, by the mid 1990s that Romitelli, encouraged by the example of Hugues Dufour, turned to amplified sound and did not look back. He did this to convey his own sensibility more effectively, but in this process it is worth pointing out that it did not betray a key principle inherited from his master, Dufour, as well as from Griset, Murail and Levinas. That, of course, of composing sound rather than composing with sound. This means that picking up sounds from a musical tradition, whatever it is not enough. What must be done is to get through to their nature, to turn a magnified glass or microphone on their attack and release transient, to process them, to bend them out of shape until new sound sculpture are born. To him, this principle was non-negotiable, and he did this goal in this way, drawing on the full energy of his worried iconoclastic soul, transfixed by excess and the outpouring of altered sounds. Here lies, I think, the originality of his style. Where the composer of L'Itinéraire had explored temporal dilation strategies, Romitelli seemed primarily eager to show how processes can converge and fall into the present moment. Looping and saturation became ways for him to construct fascinating soundscapes overflowing with energy. Think of the initial title for what later became Professor Bad Trip series of lessons. The first title was Zero Tolerance for Silence. Incidentally, not that in both cases, the first and the second title, a knowing wing comes from a citation from Pat Metheny's Electric World, and more known maybe from Gianluca Lerici, Underground's Graphic. The intention was to refocus the listener's attention, to immerse them in the drift of the incandescent material, to steer them away from the apparent linearity of processes by letting what he referred to as the emergence of a hidden violence occur. Note that it may be, with the exception of Natura Morta con Fiamme, this quartet with electronics, Romitelli had little to do with electronics. The reason for this, I believe, is that in his view, electric sound likely remained more easily legible, readable in terms of experience. It was also often a dirty sound, altered by distortion and saturation, and one that was at the same time deeply embodied. Hence, the central role of the electric guitar in his work of artistic maturity. As Jacopo Conti observed, this instrument served as a model aimed at strongly conditioning writing for the ensemble and the orchestra, an external agent able to shake up the system, to upend it completely. I think arguably a similar role to that played by electronics in instrumental creation of the avant-garde from the 50s. The electric guitar as an external agent able to shake up the system, a certain language. Take, for instance, the section corresponding to number 31 on the score for Professor Bad-Trip Lesson 2, in which idiomatic glissandos on the guitar fretboard trigger an extraordinary looping effect. The energy of an actual gesture is grafted on the instrumental ensemble. We can hear it. In lesson 2, again, not number 56 on the score, where the distortion of the guitar and bass is absorbed and somewhat dilated by the instrumental fabric. Here it is. In a similar way, the final part of an index includes moments where acoustic and electric sounds merge almost completely into a single fluid magma. While the electric guitar is ubiquitous and dominates these soundscapes, I believe it is crucial to understand its relationship to how the ensemble operates. Even though this is music that goes beyond the confine of the score-based music of the writing, the fact remains that it is skillfully written, while the movements of what has been called the world of audiotactile music, this is a term of our colleague Vincenzo Caporaletti, audiotactile music. Alors, this present is clear in some, but it do not compromise the role played by the writing, by spectral techniques. In other words, although the music is generously infused with the electric idiom, it continues to use the resource at the disposal of a skilled composer. It also displays a superb sense of form in the alternation of processes of accumulation, dilation, and densification of the oral matter. But I am curious to know whether colleagues will agree or not with this statement. It was often be said that there would be no such thing as a Romitelli style without paroxysm. A paroxysm of sound, certainly, but also of the imaginary world it conveys. Depraved perspective, altered perception, false, hypnosis, trance, a full-fledged arsenal for deviation, deformation, and more broadly, denaturalization, a process that symbolizes our globalized world. Electric or electrified sound constitutes the most decisive strategy to make a visible mark. Just think, again, of the distorted cello cadences in Professor Bad-Trip, or of the final cadence in an index of metals, which are genuine icons of a form of pantheistic experience of life. Other strategies are also implemented to serve the music's psychedelic world. Think, for instance, of the corruption of natural sound achieved through the use of poor instruments like the kazoo and the harmonica, or the specific treatment applied to some acoustic instrument, the whistling or the kazoo superimposed on the piano line in Lost of Professor Bad Trip Lesson 2 and Lesson 3, the bells dipped in the water in Golfi d'Ombra, I see Simone that performed this, and many other techniques reflecting a painstaking sense of detail. So, I think it's time to draw a conclusion. I would say that in his work, Romitelli shows that he was well aware of belonging to an era that has seen the demise of the great historical narratives, including that of a history of music explained in the light of a principle, of a pathway of evolution of musical language. When his work revisits the past and the underground, it does so with a genuine interest in the mode of expression perceived to be closer to our lived experience. The keen sense of belonging to a present that is populated with a multiplicity of traces is complemented by a both critical and retrospective stance, as part of which immersion in the atmosphere of psychedelic rock and techno provides the lifeblood for a new sonic world. His electric sound seems to me to be conceived as an attempt to cater the modes of listening that are shared by the global society in a visionary and realist spirit. The electric guitar, with its incandescent materials, plays the role of a fertilizing agent of the composition based on spectral techniques. Beyond the intention of staging disorder, what is surprising in this music ability to turn it into the gateway to an unexplored world of sound, drawing on a wide variety of symbolic and musical references. Romitelli's work deploys a temporality concentrated in the present moment. Engaged in the fascinating anamorphosis of an electrified, reproduced artificial sound, it continues to present itself as tied the power to convey, as tied to actual gesture. Its ability to speak to the body gives the power to convey intense emotion and to make it one of the most successful expression of contemporary music culture. Certainly not postmodern music then, but music which leads us to reflect intensely on musical modernity, starting from a clear awareness of our postmodern condition. So, thank you very much. Thanks for listening.
Thank you very much for this very informative talk. We now even have quite a bit of time in order to discuss, so I would open the discussion session and invite anybody either to write me something via YouTube in the chat or go to the microphones here in the room or say anything via the Zoom channel. All the channels are open. So, yeah, questions please.
Yeah, it must have. Okay. Thank you for your talk. I very much enjoyed it. I had one question pertaining to the fact that you also knew him personally, regarding his statement to postmodernism. If you guys ever discussed this personally, and if you guys argued about the fact of, or if he defended his argument why, if he personally defended his argument why his music is not postmodernism, as opposed to your. Do you understand my question? Maybe.
Maybe, but it was this character. I remember some conversation with him about postmodernism. He was strange, you know. In the same time, I can see you see the picture I've seen at the end of this talk. You can see a very fun person. So it was Fausto was ironic, was a very fun person, but at the same time, I think in music he was really serious. He cannot understand a simple hedonism in music. A music considered just as a pleasure for the time, for Sunday. So you know, for him it was really a quest of knowledge. It was something so important for him, and I think that was the principal argument against a use of music just as a way of pour meubler, comme dire, the musical tapisserie. It was not what he wanted, and so he didn't speak so much in his writing about the postmodernism, but sometimes he spoke about this. But I think there are two different questions. One could say postmodern music, or music that presents itself as postmodernist, and a sort of postmodernist condition in which music is situated. That's a question. I think he was really aware of this situation. At the same time, he has a quest for a new language that is typical of the modernist perspective. Then there is a problem of vocabulary also. You know, when I speak about modernism, I think to what in Germany is new music, neue Musik. The idea from Adorno of a music that is new from a for the language, for a question of a development of the musical language. But this question was important for Fausto. Was an important question. It's not possible to say something new with old words. Simply, he said something. So,
thank you very much.
Thank you to you.
Via YouTube, I just got a question. I read it out from GI's Unterwegs. Why do you think of electric sounds as particularly deeply embodied compared to other sounds?
Because it is able to communicate a direct relationship to the body. You know, an electric guitar and a sampler. The sampler, of course, is able to create atmosphere. In the same time, is more difficult to communicate a gesture, direct gesture. I remember a conversation with Jean-Luc Plouvier from the Ictus Ensemble. He said something as, when you are on the clavier, you are a king. You have all the power to create the sound that you want. When you are on the guitar, you have another relationship to the sound. Is a part of your body. That's something I know is not an absolute difference, because in the case just as in the other, you have some electronic transformation. For example, when you use a pedal, a loop pedal, this is an electronic transformation of something that starts from a gesture, but it is another case. The origin of the sound is more legible, more readable, I think. It's the opposite of what Pierre Schaeffer said when he spoke about the musical object in his treatise, and this possibility for our listening so to concentrate on the dynamic of the sound in itself, not as linked to a source, to a cause. And in the case of guitar, it is more difficult to do this operation, this reduced listening. I don't know if the answer was sufficient. Mm-hmm. Thank you.
I've got a question concerning the maybe performance tradition of Romitelli's pieces. He's so very much into sound, and this is something that is often not dealt with by writing a score, but by working with musicians. And sometimes when you hear the recordings, you notice that there has so much been going on between the score that you just see and the recording. Was he very open to how you perform his works once he gave some general instructions, or was he extremely precise that you get to know the tradition from other persons who played the pieces, and was the sound really exactly, for example, like the Ictus CD of Professor Bertrip, which is a very iconic recording and very much reworked in post-production. Was he very fixed on this sort of sound, or was it more an openness towards several possibilities of realizing a score?
Donc, Fausto was very precise and demanding to the performer. At the same time, he was open to many possibilities of performing his music. He, for example, for Professor Bertrip, he loved. I remember he was completely convinced by the Ictus Ensemble, but this is not a reason not to appreciate other performances. Then the question of the performance of Romitelli's music is a complex question, because in fact sometimes it's difficult to create a balance, a good balance, I think, between the electric world and the orchestral or the acoustic world. For example, the volume of the bass is sufficient to change completely the result of a composition, of a performance. This is not something that is necessarily written. It depends on the sensibility of the performance. But if you use a bass or a guitar, electric guitar, with a volume that is not sufficient, the phenomenal aspect of this music changed completely. I remember, for example, it was particularly he paid attention to this aspect. He wanted really a sound, a massive, hard sound of bass, this present of this electric sound, and I had the opportunity to hear so much version of his work, very good performed, but with a presence not so explicit of the bass. This changed completely the aspect of this music, but of course it is a possibility. In a certain way, this is not a normative aspect. It was not written, and Fausto knew very well that that is an opportunity for the performer.
I would suggest that we have a 5-minute break in order to get the technical setup for the next talk done. Thank you very much, Alessandro, Arbo, and yeah, see you anyway online. Thank you. Thank you. Is Ingrid Pustijanac already online? Is the setup working? I just don't know. No, I mean for us, the presentation, can we put it on? Ah, cool. So a warm welcome to Ingrid Pustijanac, who is joining us from the Università di Pavia. She is also a specialist in Romitelli's music and worked a lot also in the area of Romitelli's teachers like Gérard Griset, so in the spectralist music. And she is going to talk about repetition and acoustic space in the music of Fausto Romitelli, yeah, which sounds like a really major subject of what Romitelli is focusing on in his music. So I'm very curious and happy to listen to the next session.
Thank you very much. Good morning to everybody. I hope you can all hear me. And so I would first like to thank you to Oliver Korte for the invitation to be virtual in Lübeck. I was so happy to visit this town, but let's go in this virtual way. And so I'm very happy to present part of my research here because, it's about this such great public and scholars that since many years work on Fausto Romitelli music from different perspectives. So I'm sure that the discussion during these 2 days will be very, very stimulating. So let me share the my screen and my presentation. Okay, it should work now. Yes. Okay. So I would like to begin my presentation by referring straight to the title because it provides a concise expression of an issue that I have been considering for some time and for which I have not yet found a satisfactory answer. My today's presentation will be an exposition of the data from the perspective that seemed to me the most appropriate to formulate the question. However, in the following discussion with you, I hope that further aspects will emerge that can contribute to the straighter focusing on the question. The two concepts I would like to relate are that of repetition, a long-standing technique with multiple repercussions on perception, and that of acoustic space, a much more recent term that had settled down with the theoretical reflections of spectral composers, but above all with the technological progress in sound analysis and synthesis. I will start with the comment on the second term, which actually has several meanings, but I will quote Romitelli's own definition, from which I began, without listing them all. A definition from the first time I read it aroused some doubts in me. As I have already had to illustrate in some of my previous works, the question is expressed in Romitelli in a concise and systematic way, in Pertinence du Timbre, the theoretical text still unpublished, which most probably dates from the years of the Cursus de Composition et Informatique Musicale at IRCAM, therefore between 1991 and 1993, as I had the opportunity to discuss with Alessandro Arbo. The text opens with a statement that already demonstrates Romitelli's level of interiorization of spectral techniques, and because the concept of spectral morphology in its multidimensionality, he speaks about ensemble des caractéristiques, is acquired. What continues to be a challenge in this text, at least for me, is the reference to the linguistic model. In theoretical terms, the discourse seems clear, but when we examine the application of these concepts in the scores, several questions will emerge. So let me quote the beginning of the text. I'd like to demonstrate by establishing a comparison with the linguistic model that the coordination between the coexistence of simultaneous entities, namely the totality of features of spectral morphology, that determines the perception of timbre starting from a process of categorization and from the projection into acoustical space, and the training of successive entities, namely the articulation of objects and their combination on different hierarchical levels, on the basis of the process of discretization and projection into time, are not only the very foundation of linguistic communication, but also a powerful tool for the control of the formalization of musical structures. So here Romitelli tried to express his position in front of the question of musical process that was so important in the spectral technique. And he affirms that controlling a musical process means mastering the complexity of a phenomenon determined by the interaction of different functional categories. So he speaks about function, which is really very important, in my opinion, to understand some of the aspects of his techniques. Operation in space of timbre, so acoustic space, so control of the harmonic partials, characterized by the logic of adhesion, ensemble, transformation, and texture, must be functional to operation in time, characterized by combinatorial logic. So this term is also very important. Combinatorial logic, articulation of objects and gesture. Thus, a musical process must manage the evolution of an object in acoustic space by integrating it into a phonological system, so vertical dimension, and by defining it in a syntactic system, so in the horizontal aspect. But before moving on to the illustration of some music example, I would like to comment on one last excerpt from this text where Romitelli shows to conceive the formal structure in a recursive way, where the definition of level seems to play a kernel role. Let me quote just the last sentence. The whole thing is based on the principle of delimiting concentric orders. The amorphous material, the sound continuum, has to be segmented into different series of finite elements. So, to sum up, the spectral technique that allows an articulated control of the spectral morphology and the constructions of harmonic timbral structure in the continuum of a vertical acoustical space are subordinate to the idea of function, which is defined both by a specific context as well as by the psychoacoustic rules that govern the perception. It is in this space between the concept of function established in a theoretical way and its real effectiveness due to its relevance on a perceptual level that the challenge will be played. However, a premise has to be stressed. The discourse that correlates spectral morphology on one side and syntactic function is particularly complex in Romitelli, precisely because we are moving in the sphere of inharmonic contents. The music of post-spectral composers develops in the field of inharmonic and saturated spectral material. Therefore, a multiplicity of secondary parameters beyond the pure spectral content, harmonic, contributes to the definition of the status of object and its function. This aspect is determined by the subtle thresholds between sound objects derived by microvariation of their spectral morphology, which doesn't allow the difference to be perceived as significant on a syntactic level. Let me present some examples in order to better face this issue. In my first approach to Romitelli's music, I focused mostly on the spectral content and its transformation in time as part of the technique based on the instrumental synthesis and the metaphor of the sound as être vivant. But since these first approaches, the relationship between the process and object, already stressed in the theoretical writings by Gérard Griset and explored in a particular way from Thalia and Le Temps et l'Écume onwards, appears with different level of articulation. In Romitelli, seems that the very small unit of formal organization is not a single sound object, rather a group of elements that fits into a unit which undergoes two different trajectories of transformation in relation to the number of its constituent elements and their transformation. Here the metaphor of concentric orders comes to me as a very clear image of the relation between the morphology and syntax, between model and distortion, repetition and form. The example that was chronologically very near to the Pertinence du Timbre text is given by the string quartet Natura Morta con Fiamme. Let me mention just one example of this idea of group of elements, each of them following its own trajectory. In the example you see the beginning of the section E, the harmonic one of the 6 sections of the Natura Morta. The harmonic progression shown in the example is one of the 5 elements that build the section. Its trajectory is, as very often in Romitelli, as many scholars has already shown, a long descending gesture determined by the technique of the progressive compression of spectral components. There are other 4 parallel trajectories, one for each single gesture, rotating in each of the 4 string instruments. However, this early example shows the way Romitelli tried to solve both the questions of spectral morphology and the form. In the following years, Romitelli will develop the idea of temporal articulation of group of objects with even more decisive role of repetition as the material will grow from gesture with strong timbral identity. So with the next 2 examples, some new elements in the building of the repetition-based syntax will be introduced. The both example Lost for voice and 15 instruments from 1997 and Amok Coma for ensemble and electronics from 2001 have been chosen because of their specific features and also because they immediately precede and follow the cycle Professor Bathrip. I first started to work on Amok Coma a few years ago, and only in a second time I chose to work on a piece with voice. in order to investigate how the presence of voice, if so, influences the formal articulation and the process of repetition. From previous studies on entrance and index of metals by Kaltnecker, Olto, Arbo, carried out by many other scholars too, the articulation of vocal melodic lines moves with the cyclic return of the same phrase with few elements that change together with the larger context. So with this example in mind, I approach Lost, but that was a surprise for me. As you can see in the screen, the first section of Lost lasts 112 measures. After a 20 measure instrumental introduction, the voice enters with a discrete, minimal melodic movements that are repeated as single cell rather as a whole phrase. There are mainly four vocal gestures, one for each verse. The first movement of ascending minor second, so lowering G and A, the A minor arpeggio with an F and the final descending fifth A flat, E flat, A flat, the glissando gesture and the diminished third A flat, F sharp, with the final high G for the last verse. What can be observed in this example is a construction of a very short formal units that are repeated with minimal variations. The global atmosphere is rather static than process-like, and it's present since the very beginning, as the instrumental introduction shows the same articulation qualities. So the next example shows the structure of the first 20 measures instrumental introduction. As you can observe in the rhythmic cycles transcription, the duration is expressed in quavers. The texture is built by multiple rhythmic pattern layers with different durations and timbre qualities. The leading gesture, from the percepting point of view, is the ascending fourth, G-A-H-C, played by bassoon and trumpet players, both using the mouth harmonica. The pattern alternates one measure of sound with one of silence, in a process that sees a progressive augmentation of both elements' duration, and the palindromic return to the initial regular alternation of sound and silence. Other instruments contribute to the global texture with similar processes. See, for example, the palindromic structure in piano part built by the alternation of a glissando gesture and a bell-like chord, or the complementary relationship of the low A in the double bass part and the percussion part playing a bottle tuned as a low A. The function of blurring the boundaries of each pattern is carried by the two violins and viola, which are in a canonic relationship with the longest phrases among all the instruments. The tremolato playing technique contributes to the blurring effect. Let me play the audio example for you. Page is not reproduced on this slide, but the audio examples goes on. Okay, and then starts the second. At this point, we can formulate a first observation about the repetition technique that is here employed in a multi-layer voicing, which express a unique harmonic field built up by fragments of each vocal or instrumental part. The global result is a static iridescent atmosphere of changing sound objects with no temporal-oriented discourse. The same principle is used for the final section of loss, where the timbre of Hammond organ is required in the keyboard part. Here, however, the layers are more active from the harmonic point of view, and in particular in strings and winds. The static character of Hammond organ is contrasted by the progressive spectral saturation in woodwinds and strings. This activity brings to a culmination point with a concluding gesture interpreted by some scholars as signal. I refer here to writing of Martin Kaltnecker, who quotes Pierre Boulez's writings and use of signal as such a gesture. Element that defines the borders of a single process and clear formal articulation. This technique is widely used by Romitelli in many other pieces. So let me play the example with Hammond organ. Okay, so this was the whole process, and this time the repetition inserted is a really temporal-oriented process with this, even if the loop of the harmonic content of Hammond organ is static, but the temporal stretching that you can see in the Hammond cycle number reduction, duration reduction, is part of this process. So as the last example from this piece, I'd like to introduce the final section of the first part, where all the new material is introduced, this first part. And we are speaking about, you see, measures 121 and 140 that are reproduced on the screen. Here, a different voicing and texture is used. A choral-like textures and the rhythmic articulation are subordinate to the text prosody, and the whole instrumental energy is focused on only 4 harmonic aggregates that are repeated in a sort of loop. So very similar to the Hammond section, but with a completely different writing of the instrumental parts. The rhythmic articulation and the metric accent blur the loop perception as something mechanical. So let's listen this short example. Yeah, this is the introduction with the presentation of the harmonic field in piano. So from these three examples, we can already stress some common points, which I would call technique of short-term repetition. Romitelli uses the repetition of small formal units, gesture, we could say, if we focus on their expressive role, with the technique of variation. The variation can affect both the spectral content with various procedures for derivation of the pitch content, from the simple spectral compression or expansion up to the FM modulation and other techniques of the transformation, but also can affect the rhythmic articulation. The degree of transformation, and Stockhausen would say the Veränderungsgrad, is used by the composer as a powerful tool on micro, but even more on a macro formal level. The next, so here on the slide, I just transcribed the four chords and the relationship between piano and voice, so to see how the prosody are strongly related and articulated between the voice and the instrumental part. But now, here you can see the formal articulation of loss. I use a very banal system of representation where the colors express different harmonic, motivic, and instrumental textures with strong signal technique punctuation. But as you can see in the focus of the first 140 bars, shown here in the lower part of the slide, each section is built from shorter elements with different signal gestures, whites. Various contents are introduced in the first section and will return during the central part, the light blue sections, 3, with different level of change and variation, mostly harmonic, spectral density, and textural, polyphonic versus chordal writing. What seems to be a constant is the timbral characterization due to the presence of specific instruments and playing techniques. So I would say that the repetition on a higher formal level is present both as a return of the same section, often modified, or as a single gesture interpolated in new context where we can recognize this single gesture mostly because of the instrument that is linked to this gesture. In Lost, as in many other Romitelli's work, all these levels of repetition are present and contribute to the coherence of the work, even if the global process is usually subordinated to a progressive distortion and destruction of all levels of harmonic, rhythmic, and textural characterization, as we have already seen in many works and analyses. Before presenting you very shortly the second piece, Amok Goma, let me comment the fact that the literature on repetition in music, both from composers and theoreticians' perspective, is rich and stimulating. I will not discuss today various positions because I'm more interested in the discussion with all of you, starting from the musical examples. But I would like to mention here some of David Huron's studies, as they fit perfectly to the way Romitelli creates the play between the known and unknown, or in Huron's words, how Romitelli controlled the habituation process. There are some coefficients that Huron stressed, which are the speed of habituation, which are really very, very useful to examine and to analyze the process of transformation in almost all Romitelli's work. But let me go to the conclusion and the last examples. As an extreme example of the technique of repetition used on various formal levels, I will mention shortly the work Amok Goma. I have already presented some of the results in a previous conference, but with a focus on harmonic content. What I'd like to show today is extraordinary example of how Romitelli developed in the last years of his production a high level of clear formal articulation with even more simple procedures obtained by a reduction of the material. Let's shortly listen just the very beginning of Amok Coma. There is a repetition. Okay, and so on. So the technique is the same that we have already seen in the choral section of Lost. A reduced number of harmonic aggregates that are repeated with a process of gradual expanding of the initial phrase. For Amok Coma, here is the continuation of the first phrase, but here are the reduction of the harmonic content. So I have identified 22 different harmonic entities for the first 140 measures. Unfortunately, the archival material in the Romitelli's collection housed in Fondazione Cini doesn't allow to understand the process of generation of this field with precision. Maybe our colleague Fabian Luchterhand, that will speak about Amok Coma, would add some more insight in this question. I have suggested some possibilities, but the work still has to be finished. However, what is interesting to observe here is how Romitelli uses these 22 chords or aggregates in order to build formal units that repeat a specific sequence with a degree of variation due to the introduction or removing of single elements in the sequence. So you can see the sequence is 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, then 1, 2, 4, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 4, 5, 1, 2, 4, 5, 6, and so on. So with the certain cyclicity or return of the main of the first chord, or even the 22nd chord, which is very near to the first one. So parallel to this process, there is also gradual transformation of the choral writing into polyphonic texture. So I would say the harmonizer effect in electronic music, often used by Romitelli. The transparent horizontal voicing takes over in the central part of the piece. Here only 4 chords are repeated systematically, with transformation that we have already seen in Lost: metric, rhythmic, and playing techniques elements. The result is a sort of contemplative Renaissance timbre central section. That is the section of the palindromic form of Amok Coma, as the title suggests. So, I will not formulate any conclusion. The examples I presented show how the technique of repetition in Romitelli's compositional technique affects various levels of articulation and is linked to the various musical traditions. How these procedures have been inspired also by a linguistic model is still an issue for me. However, this model, or its theoretical potentiality, offered to Romitelli a way to express his need to a complex inharmonic sound world and a clear musical discourse that communicates with the audience. The play between known and unknown, repetition and difference, stasis and movement has reached in Romitelli's music a new horizon of possibility. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ingrid Pustijanac. The session for questions is open. Yeah, anybody in the room having a question? Or on YouTube again, I'm going to check again. I was wondering about the quote that we become less attentive when you repeat material. I find this very interesting if you look at Romitelli, because one could discuss this in several different ways. How do you feel about the repetition in Romitelli's work? How does it work with attentionness and yeah?
You're referring to the David Huron quotation, or yeah, that one. So as I try to express, there is no repetition in Romitelli, actually. So if just to say a very drastic statement, there is no identical repetition. So if we understand repetition as the return of the identical material, there is no such a thing in Romitelli, because Romitelli shows to work on details on various levels, as I stress. So spectral content is the first one, but if the spectral content is stable, so it's there is no changes in the spectral content, then we have a lot of changes in the rhythmic articulation. So there are quavers that are more or less one quaver, so that has a very important influence on the metric balance of the phrase. Or if even the rhythmical dimension is preserved, then we have the playing techniques that changes. So even if you listen to the same gesture from the rhythmic and harmonic point of view, the timbral results is so different, or is slightly different. It really depends of the Veränderungsgrad that is enacted in the certain process. So you have this sensation to have something very similar but is not identical, because you perceive it as identical but is not. And that is one of the reasons why it's very difficult to represent the analytical results of the repetition process, because you have to fit in a scheme a lot of different parameters. So maybe there is the harmonic content that is always the same chord, but then you have a tremolo and the molto sul ponticello. The second one is sul ponticello. The third one is ordinario. The fourth one is sul tasto. Or in the same moment, you have a kazoo inspiring or expiring, or you have the campana with the campana glissando in water, or whatever. So it's such a master technique of working on details that are really controlled gesture by gesture. And also what is astonishing to me is how they are fit into larger trajectories. So you can find the same harmonic content with the similar orchestration 100 bars after a first presentation, but even in a new way. There is something more. Maybe there is a harmonic partial or inharmonic partial that has been added, or you can also, maybe you can see that the normal flute becomes piccolo, or there is a flatter zunge into the flute sound. So what to say? Is there the possibility of habituation? I think there is, because Romitelli has interiorized the spectral tradition in, I would say, in the way that he knows that the changes, that the difference is too big, then you can lose the perception of the syntax. So you are working into the contrast. But when Romitelli wants a contrast, then he builds a contrast. So then it's not just a variation of some parameters. Then the parameters are contrasted by almost all levels. So it's a very complex way of controlling all the dimension, the vertical and horizontal dimension. So for this reason, this idea of linguistic model and this phonetic and phonological dimension is very fascinating to me. And it's also, I can see it in the Romitelli's works, but what is hard is really analytical representation that can catch up all this complexity. This is really something that even in the early, but even more in the last Romitelli's work, is due with such a mastery that is really very effective also from the perceptual point of view.
Ingrid, if I can.
Yeah.
I think it's very interesting what you say. I think the phonological model oriented his first reflection. You spoke about this paper. I remember this paper as was the first reflection of a composer at the IRCAM. It was a sort of, I would say, necessary reference. We know how much phonology was a necessary step for composer after Berio. But do you really think it remained so present afterwards? Because I have the impression that this reference has disappeared. It was a way of saying that, essentially, that there is in the continuous a discretion, the discrete unit, a question that from a vision of the continuity that is typical of the spectral thinking is important, of course. A different that make it possible for us to pass discontinuously from a status A to a status B in perception.
Yeah. That is,
I think it was the principal question. Then phonology disappeared in his discourse, in his way of thinking. But it is interesting for you. You think it is possible to use this reference as a model to understand what he did later?
No, I don't.
No.
So
Okay.
how I understand the question is, and also what I could see in the scores mostly, so there is the first period that he really somehow tries to control the vertical dimension of acoustical space with a very teeny tuning. So if you see in Natura Morta, he really wants to change a quarter of tone, then a sixth of tone, then a 15 hertz for each step in order to build this process of extending the major, the minor third HD. So at that point, probably he really tries to work into the acoustical space in so teeny way, so with the quarter tone grid, or even less. So maybe if a 1/6 tone grid, but then. He just understood that this on perceptual level, as you have stressed, is not so significant. It's not so, there is no force to be a differential element of differentiation, if I can say that. So if we analyze the later works' harmonic content, then the harmonies are even more and more built as an inharmonic complex spectra, where the harmonic field, the vertical field, and the timbre, so the orchestration, becomes the field where he was trying to experiment this idea of phonology, but fine-tuning of the content, but not anymore from building the partial. Because if you see the harmonic aggregates could be kind of really, I see Varese construction, or any kind of some of them are also, they have symmetric relationship into the aggregates. So, or there are some preferences to the major or minor triad in the central part of the register, and then the octave doubling in a very high register, no low register. So there is the conceiving of the acoustical space that cannot maybe, so it's a phonology, but in a very rude way, if we can express this. Yeah, so it's, I totally agree. It was a starting point to understand how the vertical content can and could be put in the relationship with the temporal dimension because of the shorter duration of the objects and gesture. If we think on Murail, and the previous, even Kaya Sariafro, if you want, the processes and also the gesture has different duration. There are not discrete objects that are combined between them in a higher syntaxes. There are also this example. But yeah, he mastered gradually this idea of, and Amok Koma for me was really a surprise. There are 20 chords that could probably be derived one from another, but there are different, 22 different aggregates that control 140 measures. So yeah, with some extension, harmonizing effects in some points, but the idea is that the harmonic field is static. So phonology on that point, from that point of view, I think it was a very nice and important metaphor. Also model, if maybe not metaphor, also model for the thinking of about his proper compositional technique. Yeah. Thank you.
Listeners is interested in whether the text will be published at some point. Are there any information about that?
Yes, so there are some scholars that are working on the editing. The text has some problems because it's it's a text for maybe for a presentation. So it's the written form has some redactional problems, but the Fondazione Cini is on the project. So I really hope because it's one of the most important texts from this period of the post-spectral composer. So I hope that in the next very next future the text will be published. Hopefully, yeah.
And another question from Pietro Dossena: could the linguistic influence on Romitelli's approach to repetition have been influenced by Rouvet and Natier's method of paradigmatic analysis, referring to the systematic and paradigmatic, sorry.
Yes, what to say? In those years, the paradigmatic and syntagmatic model developed by Rouvet and then by Natier was important. That was the years of its diffusion. So I would say, there are some possibilities to apply this model, but if there are direct influences from one to the other, I cannot say. Maybe Alessandro could, but I know Natier was in Paris at a certain point, but before Romitelli. So it was a very famous model, but I didn't find in any source or discourse or writing or presentation the mention of paradigmatic model. Yeah, it's the segmentation as that I show in Amok Koma could remember as a model, analytical model, this approach, but it should be developed in a little bit different way. Yeah, I'm not sure if we could assess this.
I can see.
Thank you, Alessandro.
I remember he knew the text of by Rouvet. He knew. I spoke with him about this, the function of repetition. So, but I think Actually, the function is completely different as a result, because usually, in this text you have the function of repetition as something that is necessary to consolidate, to affirmatively confirm something, is a structural function. But in Romitelli's music is something completely different, more original it may be. The repetition is the model of the loop, is the model that derives the process, make it mechanically rotate on itself, open a temporal fissure. No, something that that is not so just a structural technique. No, but I remember he knew the text by Rouvet, and because it was at this period that all the musicologists, musicians spoke about this, Nattier, Rouvet, semiology, and so it was really very usual.
Yeah, thank you very much for the first session. I've got a strange announcement to make. There is coffee in Lübeck. So it's very sad. Normally it's one of the nicest parts of a conference, but we probably will have coffee in lots of different places and see each other in, yeah, 3/4 of an hour.
So hello to you guys at the Zoom session. I will leave this open. If you, for any case, want to talk to each other, then feel free, please.
Thomas, ich glaube, der nächste